Hi, and welcome to my FlossTube channel. I'm Jane Farish, and once again, I am so glad that you're here with me today. I'm going to start off with welcoming another shop to our Jane Hattersley Stitch Along, and that's Acorns Threads out in Portland, Oregon. So very happy to give a shout out to that shop. And as I have been doing, I will add them to the list and post that list in the comments that go along with this episode. So these are the shops that you can contact to get the chart as well as the fabric and floss or silk threads, whatever you want to stitch with, for the Jane Hattersley Stitch Along. Now, there is some confusion because I do have two stitch alongs that are kind of gonna, they're gonna overlap by about 6 weeks. And that's Roxy and Jane Hattersley, two completely different stitch alongs. And so at the end of this episode, I will go into some details about describing each one of them and where they're alike and where they're different, and hopefully to untangle some of that confusion. I wrote myself a great big note to remind you to subscribe to my channel. One of the ways that I'm celebrating my 40th year as a designer and teacher in this wonderful cross-stitch industry of ours is to do a drawing each month with some sort of a sweet prize for one of my subscribers. So make sure that you do that. Another way that I'm going to celebrate this anniversary is to reintroduce some of my favorite designs from over these 40 years. And I'm going to start with the Weather Vane horse. This is based on an overshot weaving pattern and using just a very traditional weather vane shape, which ultimately became part of my logo. So it has a really special place in my heart for that reason. The chart is not in my Etsy shop as of this exact moment, but I am hoping that by the end of the day and certainly by tomorrow, it will be, the listing will be up and functioning just fine. And as a way of celebrating these designs for my 40th anniversary, I decided to price them at $4.40, which may seem a little, I don't know, hope it isn't too cute, but at any rate, I just thought it would be kind of a fun way of both introducing some of my favorites and also pricing them in a way that makes them really accessible to people. Another way that I'm going to celebrate is by creating some freebie designs that are takeoffs from these vintage designs. And the first one I'm going to do, partly in celebration of Valentine's Day and also because I think hearts are just very classic, is to do this design that uses the same overshot pattern as in the Weather Vane horse. And it's going to be, I'm going to actually make this into a scissor fob. So there's going to be another heart like this one that's actually upside down on either side. And then the way it's constructed, the 3 hearts will kind of be on 3 different sides of it. But I'll explain that next week. So this is that overshot pattern, and the way I stitch this is by taking diagonal trips throughout the chart. And I'll explain that more in my blog that goes along with this. So you will find the freebie chart on my blog, jeanfarishneedleworks.com. You will find the Weather Vane horse pattern as a PDF in my Etsy shop. So that's just kind of a way that I'm taking a look back at my 40 years and reminiscing and celebrating all at the same time. I want to do a little bit more follow-up on that whole topic of framing and how to talk to your framer and how to understand what they're telling you about. I mentioned that I asked my framer to put a spacer between my sampler and the glass. The whole idea of a spacer is to keep the glass off the surface of the embroidery. Now, part of that is to not squish the stitches. Part of it also is for there to be an air barrier between the glass and the needlework. Spacers also function when the embroidery is more three-dimensional, like stump work, which we have not talked about yet at all. Stump work is an absolutely fascinating arm of embroidery where the stitching actually is three-dimensional. It like if you're doing petals of a flower, the petals are actually, you know, off the surface of the embroidery. So a spacer is absolutely essential when you're doing that type of embroidery. So I stopped by my local framer and I asked Jill if she would give me some just leftover samples of spacers. And so I came home with a whole big assortment. So let me show you how these function. The first thing to realize is that in a good frame, there's actually a groove here that that the embroidery is going to fit in this. It's going to actually lie in this groove. So the spacers, and that's what these are right here. So the spacer will actually fit in that groove and will then keep the glass off the surface of the embroidery. So the glass would be lying in here, and then the spacer, and then the embroidery. So I hope that makes sense. I can see now that if I had a piece of glass, it would be even more clear, but I don't think I have one that's going to fit in here. Each week I make an outline of what I want to talk about, and I gather the props I think I'm going to need to illustrate what I want to talk about. And it always seems like there's something missing, and obviously a piece of glass that's cut that would fit this frame would have been helpful, but I didn't think about that. So again, when we talk about spacers, we're talking about kind of creating a sandwich. You've got your frame, your glass, your spacer, your needlework, and that just is a safe way of framing your needlework. There are times that spacers are not necessary and with embroidery. And the classic one is if you have a mat, because when you think about it, the mat board itself creates a spacer. So don't be alarmed if your framer says they're not necessary if you're using mats. But if you don't have a mat, I would say a spacer is pretty essential. Now, the other thing that I want to just point out is that they come, Jill gave me a black one, a white one, and a clear one. And the choice of which one to use is going to depend on the frame and the color of the embroidery, etc. So that's one thing. And also they do come in different depths. So, you know, again, that's one of the areas where I rely on the expertise and the experience of my framer. And I would just encourage you that if you don't do framing yourself, that when you are shopping around for a framer, perhaps start with a smaller piece and kind of, you know, you're taking that framer for a test drive. You're building a relationship with them. They're finding out what your style is, and you're finding out what their style is. Those of you who first became acquainted with me on Facebook know that I'm fairly active on it. I think sometimes I spend too much time on Facebook and not enough time stitching and designing, but I am trying to achieve a balance. So this week, one of the questions that came up in a group was separating strands and separating plies. So a little bit of terminology here. When we talk about embroidery floss, and that's, what I'm saying now is exclusively about embroidery floss, because this topic is huge, and the thread industry has some very specific requirements in the way threads are labeled. And one of those things I'm finding out has to do with plies. So let's talk about terminology. And from the outset, I'm going to tell you that it can be very, very confusing for a layperson. And part of that's because the industry itself is sometimes confusing. Because when we use the word thread, we use it as a noun, we use it as a verb. We thread our needle with thread. We are stitching, if you're stitching on linen or even weave, you're stitching on a fabric that you're counting threads. Well, that's not counting the threads that are in the eye of your needle, that's counting the threads that are on your fabric. And if you stitch on Aida, you still are stitching on a fabric that's made up of threads. So the word thread gets threaded throughout our conversations here, there, and everywhere. So bear with me because I'm going to use that thread in several different ways. So when we talk about a 6-strand embroidery floss, you can see here that I have 6 threads within this piece of embroidery floss. So these are not plies, these are strands. And when we talk about separating the strands, very typically people talk about tapping the end so you can see them, and then you grab a hold of one and you pull it out, and then you grab a hold of if you're stitching with 2 strands, and you grab a hold of a second one and you pull it out. So this is stitching with 2 strands of embroidery floss. Now the next thing I want to show you, and this end is darker, so I'm going to flip it around here. So now here's 1 strand of embroidery floss, and I'm hoping I can get close enough here for you to see this. If I then tap this, you can start seeing where it can be separated. These are plies. This is 1 ply, this is 2 ply. So this embroidery floss is a 2-ply floss. And when you look at it really carefully, I'm hoping I can get the lighting here, you can see that it's twisted together. That's why it's sort of curly looking. So when we talk about separating floss, you separate the strands, you do not separate the plies. So I hope that demystifies that bit of terminology just a little bit. Recently, somebody asked about how to get rid of the shadow that seems to be left behind when you are ripping out stitches. And it happens mostly if you're ripping out dark stitches or brightly colored stitches, but it happens pretty frequently. We talked about how you can use sticky tape, you can use a white unused eraser. But one of the things I forgot about, and I was reminded by a comment by Michelle and others, that a clean mascara wand, one that's never been used before, is also another good little tool to have in your sewing box to just kind of brush off those fuzzies. Remember to do it on both sides. Since I don't have one, I decided to go online and see how easily available they are. And I was quite surprised that places like Sally Beauty and other places sell packages of 6 or 12. You know, you can get a dozen of them for like less than $4. Even Walmart.com, I found them. So they're pretty readily available to, you know, grab a supply, and, you know, you probably don't need 12, but share them with your friends. That would be kind of a nice thing to do. So now let's talk about the 2 stitch alongs. And I'm going to start with Roxy because that one is scheduled to start first. Roxy is a mystery stitch along, which means that no one has seen the entire design yet. I haven't stitched the entire design yet. It is revealed in segments. I'm going to do it in 6 parts. The chart is only available from me because of the very nature of a mystery stitch along. However, shops can get involved, and I'm hoping that they will, by selling the linen or even weave, as well as the threads for Roxy. Now, back in the beginning of January 4th was my cutoff date to order kits from me, simply because I needed to tell my supplier that week exactly how much floss I needed for the kits that had been ordered to that point. So that's all in the works. So if you missed out on getting the complete kit, you can certainly still be involved by shopping your stash or going to your local Needleworks store or whatever online resource that you use to get the fabric and the threads. Now, just this weekend, I sent out an email to all the shops that are on my email list with a list of supplies, so they have an idea what we're talking about. By the way, I've also sent out an email to everyone that I have an order. If I have an order from you for a kit or from a chart that was sent to me by email, then I have replied by sending out an email this weekend. One email went out to the people who are on the kit list, and a different email went out to the people that are on the chart list, so that they know exactly what's going on. So if you didn't get one of those, but you know you sent me an email previously, please check your junk folder or spam folder or whatever you want to call it, because it may have landed there. Now, I can still take orders for the charts because that doesn't involve my suppliers. So if you still want to get involved and you have not emailed me, send me an email telling me you would like to have get the chart. Now, I keep saying chart, but that one will also come along with a tutorial video. Each one of the 6 segments will have a video that will teach you the stitches that are involved in that portion of it. And that's another big distinction between Roxy and Jane. Roxy will have special or fancy stitches in it, like the satin stitch, the herringbone stitch, the rice stitch, whereas Jane is 100% cross stitch. Let me think what else I need to tell you about Roxy. This one, because of the fancy stitches, primarily the satin stitch, I am strongly suggesting that you do it on linen or even weave. Now, I have decided that I would also chart it for cross stitch for Aida, and just because of the nature of the satin stitch, it did mean recharting it. So when I send out the PDFs, there will be pages that will be labeled for linen and even weave and pages that will be labeled for Aida. So make sure that you print the pages that apply to the type of fabric that you're using. So again, I don't want to leave my Aida stitches out of this altogether. And some of the fancy stitches can still be done on Aida, but that inner border, which is satin stitch, it just cannot be done on Aida effectively. So I translated that into cross stitch. The other thing to say about this is, especially if you're watching this video and it's not still January, when I am done with the 6 segments, I will publish it and shops will be able to sell it. So I think I've covered all the things about Roxy. So let's talk about Jane. So Jane Hattersley is a brand new antique sampler reproduction, and it is 100% cross stitch. So this one can easily be done on Aida. I am not producing kits for this one at all. There was really no need to, since it's not a mystery sampler stitch along. And shops have been very eagerly awaiting hearing from you to get the chart and the fabric and the threads for that. Now, a couple of the shops have really stepped up and they have figured out silk conversions, and I applaud them for doing that. I just don't have the supplies to figure out the silk equivalents. So they have done that. So do ask them about silk. This one will start on April 9th because that's the date that's on Jane's sampler. So the two are going to overlap by about 6 weeks. And trying to think out what else is different about the two of them. Oh, if you prefer a PDF rather than a printed chart for Jane Hattersley, you can get that from my Etsy store starting probably like middle of February, maybe sooner. I'll see. I guess I will go ahead and put that out there so that if you want the PDF, you will have the list of flosses and fabric suggestions. So yeah, I think that will work. And last but not least, I had a delightful surprise this week. In the mail, I received this gift from Ramonia of Casey, Iowa, with a great project bag, and inside another little bag, and inside that one, a little Ort container, which is beautiful, and a little sponge container, which we all know what that's for. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness of this gift, and I can't wait to put it to work. And I think that's pretty much a wrap for this week. I am so glad that you are sharing this time with me, and between now and next week, stitch happy and stay safe. I'll see you then.